Welcome to the overview of the book of Genesis. The book of Genesis is foundational. In fact, it's more foundational than any other book to understanding the story of the Bible. Genesis not only contains vital information as to the origin of all things, because of that, it contains information that's vital to understanding the meaning of all things. The book of Genesis, the title means origins. Therefore, in Genesis, we're given the origin of the universe. We're given the origin of life. We're given the origin of man, the origin of marriage, of sin, of human government. We're given the origin of culture, of nations, of religion, and we're given the origin of Israel. Genesis not only provides a foundation for understanding the created world, it is also foundational for understanding the rest of the Bible. For instance, people in Genesis like Abraham and Isaac and Jacob are frequently referred to throughout the rest of Scripture. Without Genesis, we would have no idea what their role or purpose was in God's plan. There are over 200 quotations or allusions to Genesis given in the New Testament. In fact, every one of the New Testament writers refers to a passage in Genesis 1 through 11. In fact, Jesus himself makes reference to something that happens in Genesis 1 through 11 at least 6 times in his ministry. What's the context of the book of Genesis? I think as you read through, you want to understand a little bit of that context. Genesis is the first book in the Pentateuch, which was written by Moses. When the children of Israel actually received what is in the book of Genesis, they were wandering in the wilderness. They needed to know who they were as a people. They needed to understand what God's purpose for them was. They had just come out of Egypt 40 years earlier, and they needed to understand what God had in store for them. Genesis shows them that they were a covenant people, the covenant people, chosen by God to be a great nation. And they were heirs to an unconditional covenant with God through their forefathers. So Genesis disclosed to the nation Israel an authoritative witness of their history and of their future. So it was a significant book. Israel was becoming a major part of God's program to redeem the world to himself. In fact, the key verse that I believe is the key verse in the book of Genesis is found in chapter 12, where God calls Abraham to himself. You'll see that in the first 4 verses. Now, the book of Genesis is naturally divided into 2 sections. First, you'll notice as you read in chapters 1 through 11, we're given the origin of all things. There's a lot of first, and it's very general and very broad. This section includes creation. It includes the fall of man. It includes the promise of a redeemer, the worldwide flood. It includes the dispersion of the nations at the Tower of Babel. That's the first section, chapters 1 through 11. But when we come to chapter 12, beginning there, from chapter 12 through the rest of the book, chapter 50, we are given the history of God's people. This section includes the families of Abraham, the families of Isaac, the families of Jacob, and the families of Joseph. Now, there are 10 internal divisions that you may not see, but are very clearly inserted or given by Moses when he recorded Genesis. These are found in the repeated statement, "These are the generations of," or in your translation it may see, "This is the account of," or "This is the history of." Each statement alerts us to the progression of God's plan. It moves us sequentially from one section to the next. In chapter 1, we're given the account of creation. Genesis begins with these words, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." This is a staggering statement right out of the gate. God's revelation of himself in Scripture begins with himself as the transcendent God outside of his creation and existing before his creation. This statement is amazing in the sense that it refutes all of the major isms today. It refutes atheism, stating that before anything was, God existed. It refutes polytheism, stating that there is only one God. It wasn't that gods created, but God created. It refutes pantheism, stating that God existed apart from his creation. And it refutes evolution, stating that God created. He made from nothing. Then in Genesis chapters 2 through 4, we're given the generations of the heaven and the earth. This section explains what became of God's creation. It begins with the description of the creation of Adam and Eve, and it ends with tracing the effects that sin had on Adam's descendants. Through the entrance of sin into God's creation, everything was devastatingly altered. There was judgment from God. The serpent, the woman, the man, all were cursed. But there was also grace, as God promised that one would come to deal with the problem of sin by defeating the serpent. In chapter 5, we're given a second section, the generations of Adam. God had said that sin would bring death. And reading Genesis 5 is sort of like walking through a cemetery. As this chapter chronicles Adam's descendants until Noah, one refrain is repeated in chapter 5 over and over again. 8 times it says that so-and-so lived many years and then died. And the phrase, and he died, and he died, and he died is given 8 times. However, as you read, I want you to notice something really important right in the middle of that chapter. Right in the middle of chapter, this refrain is broken and a glimmer of hope appears when it comes to Enoch. Verse 24 says, Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. When we come to chapters 6 through 9, we're given the generations of Noah. In the creation account, God saw that everything was good. In chapter 6, however, God saw that the intent of man's heart and thoughts were only evil continually. With man's wickedness having run amok, God destroyed the world by water. But he demonstrated grace to Noah and saved he and his family. God gave them an unconditional promise that he will never destroy the earth with a flood again. And so from that point forward, Israel would know that God is a covenant-making and covenant-keeping God. In chapter 10, we are given the generations of Noah's sons. After the flood, Noah's sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, prospered and they propagated. The nations that they fathered spread abroad on the earth after the flood. But in the first 9 verses of chapter 11, God judged the nations who all then migrated to the land, who had migrated to the land of Shinar and settled there. The peoples of the earth rebelled against God's command to fill the earth, and in an attempt to keep from being dispersed throughout the whole earth, they organized in their rebellion against God. However, God confounded and confronted their language, and so everyone at that point was forced to scatter and fill the earth according to God's command. Different people groups each took elements of paganism and developed their own idolatrous systems. Well, in chapters 11, we're given the generation of Shem, and then in chapters 12 through 25, we are given the generations of Terah. Now, this section, chapters 12 through 25, traces the ancestry of Abraham back to Shem, who were the sons of Noah, linking then Abraham to Adam. And with the opening of closing chapter 11, there is a major shift of emphasis in the book of Genesis. The first 11 chapters, as you read, are filled with human failure. There's divine cursing. However, Genesis 12, throughout the rest of the book, is filled with God's blessing through one family, the family of Abraham and his descendants. Nearly 1/4 of Genesis is actually devoted to the life of Abraham. Abraham actually had grown up in a home where false gods were worshipped. The most significant element in this section of Scripture is the covenant that God made with this man Abraham and his descendants. This covenant promised for Abraham land, it promised prominence, and it promised blessing. And the sign of God's covenant with Abraham was circumcision. This would become a requirement for the people of God. We find in Abraham, in this section, both failures and successes. For instance, in chapter 12, Abraham followed God, leaving everything that he had known in Ur. However, he also had fled to Egypt during a severe famine, and he jeopardized his wife's safety. In chapter 14, Abraham rescued his nephew Lot, along with the king of Sodom. And in chapter 15, God confirmed his covenant with Abraham. However, in chapter 16, Abraham fathers a child by Sarah's handmaid, Hagar, in order to try to produce an heir according to human wisdom. That son, Ishmael, was later sent away along with his mother by Abraham. But when Abraham was 99 years old, God told him that his wife Sarah would give birth to a son. And when Abraham was 100 years old, that is precisely what happened. They gave birth to, or Sarah gave birth to, the son of promise named Isaac. When Isaac was of age, Abraham sent his servant to his former homeland to find a bride for his son Isaac. And Rebekah was the answer to that servant's prayer. In chapter 25, we are given the generations of Ishmael. Now, these few verses provide a list of the descendants of Ishmael, who was Abraham's son through Hagar. And the purpose of this brief section is to identify the genealogical differences between the two sons of Abraham, Isaac, who was the son of promise, and Ishmael. So that was important for the children of Israel to know. In chapters 26 through 35, we were given the generations of Isaac. Now, after pleading to the Lord for a son, Isaac's wife, Rebekah, gave birth to twins, Jacob and Esau. Now, from the very beginning, even while they were still in the womb, there was strife between these brothers. The strife was really never completely resolved. Chapter 30 in Genesis records how the 12 sons of Jacob came to be, and it was really quite a mess. Jacob fathered all of these children through 4 different women, and these 12 sons became the heads of the 12 tribes of Israel. In chapter 36 in Genesis, we're given the generations of Esau, and then in chapters 36 through 50, we're given the generations of the sons of Jacob. This really focuses on one primary son named Joseph. Joseph was sold into slavery by his other brothers. He was taken down to Egypt, where he ended up serving Potiphar. He was accused of rape and thrown into prison, but he interpreted dreams. The Lord was with him. Eventually, he interpreted Pharaoh's dream, and he was elevated to prime minister in Israel, or in Egypt. Joseph ended up bringing his father and his brothers and their families down into Egypt, and through him, God saved the entire nation. So while the sons of Jacob were in Egypt for 400 years, they grew into a great nation called Israel. The 12 sons of Jacob became the 12 heads of the tribes. And that's where Genesis ends. It leaves God's people in Egypt growing to be a great nation. Now, Genesis is a remarkable account of God and his dealings with his children. Sin broke the perfect peace between God and humanity, and instead of enjoying the blessing that God intended, humanity was burdened with the curse. But God established his plan for redemption and blessing through covenants, first with Abraham, and then reaffirmed through Isaac and Jacob. Genesis sets the stage for the rest of God's plan to redeem the world through his Son, Jesus Christ. As you read through Genesis, it's going to be easy to sort of get lost in the genealogies and all the names that you can't pronounce, but there is a big picture that you need to see. As you read through the book, keep God in focus. Keep God in focus. Consider his character. Think about if you were an Israelite who was just released from slavery and were reading this for the first time. What would your takeaway be? Would you marvel at God's power over creation? Would you be struck with how God views sin? Would you be encouraged by the way that he fulfilled his promises, not just to his covenant people, but to everyone? So as you read, an awareness of God and who he is should evoke something in your heart. It should evoke a heart of worship, and it should evoke within you an expectant hope. This is the beginning of God's story, and I hope you'll enjoy the journey.